Evening. I'm Mary Madden, the Director of the Museum and Education Division for the Kansas State Historical Society. Thank you for joining us tonight for our monthly virtual Museum After Hours program coming to you from the Kansas Museum of History. As always, tonight's program will be followed by a question and answer period at the end with the presenter. Please use the Q&A link to enter your questions and we'll get to as many as we can. Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Sandra Enriquez, Assistant Professor of History and the Director of Public History Emphasis at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. A native of Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, Enriquez's research and teaching interests include Latinx history, urban history, social movements, and public history. Tonight's program brings together many of her interests and expertise. Making a home in the Heartland, Mexican immigration to Kansas City in the early 20th century. In the first decade of the 20th century, thousands of Mexicans fleeing political turmoil arrived in Kansas City, searching for new lives and opportunities. This new population became critical in Kansas City's industrial success and transformed the social and economic landscape of the region. Dr. Enriquez shows that despite facing discrimination, racism, and exploitation, Mexican Americans established roots in the city and created vibrant communities on both sides of the state line. They made the Heartland their home. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Enriquez.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I know it's a Friday during summer, and especially I'm joining you from Kansas City. So if you have been navigating the crazy heat wave that we've been dealing with, I know it's a much needed relief to be able to, enjoy the nice weather. So I am very appreciative that you're here with me today to have this conversation. I wanted to take a quick minute to thank Mary Madden and Louis Hare, who invited me to be part of this program, and the rest of the Kansas Historical Society staff. So I will be sharing my screen really quick before I get started, and then we can get going in our discussion. All right. Let me see if I can actually do this, given that I am, yep, I hope you can see that. All right, so I'm going to start with a quick, let me see, I think I may have to change my, oh, I am sharing my screen, but it's not letting me do the slideshow. I see. Sorry, this is a troubleshooting thing that I wasn't anticipating. So you'd think, I've been teaching online for about a year and a half now, and you would think that I would know what the heck I'm doing, but just give me a second while I switch my screens and then I will get started again. Doing the same thing. So I am going to go ahead and just get started and hope that I can remember everything that I can do here. So I apologize for doing this because I cannot see it on the other side. I thought that we would be able to just, that I would be able to see my presentation, but I clearly am having issues. So I apologize for that. Okay, let me do this again. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen, and I apologize that I'm going to have my little part over here, but I will not be able to see the rest of my screen or my presentation notes if I don't do this. So I'm going to try again.
Do you just want to hit presenter view? at the top?
Yeah, so, well, yeah, no, it's the setup that I have. It's blocking my computer notes, so I can't have my presentation. So I apologize.
No problem.
But okay, I hope everyone can see that. I know that it's strange to not just have the presentation bigger than that. So I'll try to, make it work, I promise. All right. So I just wanted to start with a quick story to kind of encapsulate what the immigrant experience at that time would be. So in 1920, Manuel and Silveria Lopez arrived in Kansas City, Missouri. Manuel, who was involved in the Mexican Revolution at the time, in his native San Luis Potosí, had fled had fled Mexico for safety. It was a life or death situation, so he knew he had to flee. The couple had spent some time laboring in Texas when they first arrived to the United States and moved to Missouri in search of a better life for their growing family. The Lopez's ended up settling in the West Side, which was the biggest Mexican colony at that time in the Missouri side. Manuel was able to find employment with the Frisco Railroad, where he would work until he retired. Silveria, on the other hand, devoted her life to her 7 children and raising them and ensuring them that they were meeting everything that they needed at the time. The Lopez's, like so many folks, they didn't have any family in Kansas City. They came alone. It was just them and their kids, and that was it. But they soon planted their roots and made the world a little less scary for their family. They were part of a tight-knit community. They attended Our Lady of Guadalupe Church on 23rd Street, and they joined neighborhood organizations, patronized community-owned businesses in the West Side, and even joined became very, very involved in the church. And unbeknownst to Manuel and Silveria, their lives would become a kind of textbook example of the Mexican experience in the Kansas City area. I think I'm going to have to do this a little smaller so you all can see it. There we go. During the first decades of the 20th century, thousands of Mexican families like the Lopez's had to flee political turmoil, and they arrived in the Kansas City area searching for new lives and opportunities. This new population, as Mary mentioned, became very integral in the making and sustaining and boosting of Kansas City, both sides of the state line. And they were able to transform the social and economic landscape of the region, a region unlike the Southwest that did not have a major Mexican or Mexican-American population at the time. Settling in the Midwest was no easy feat. Mexican immigrants faced lots of discrimination, lots of racism, and lots of exploitation. But despite this, Mexican families were able to establish roots in the city, and they were able to create a number of vibrant communities on both sides of the state line. And so in today's presentation, I'm going to kind of discuss the local and the national factors that are leading us to this period of Mexican immigration to the area. Discuss a little of the patterns and settlements of the patterns of employment and labor for the newcomers, how they navigated life in the Midwest, and then finally, how they created vibrant communities and claimed their own space within the 2 Kansas cities. And so, like Manuel, many Mexican immigrants left the Mexican nation to escape political violence and turmoil. This is what I call a push factor. So this is going to be the reason why folks are going to be forced, to leave their lives behind and everything that is so familiar to them. Since the turn of the 20th century, economic policies and political laws in Mexico had greatly affected working class people in cities and rural areas alike. And by the time that when the Mexican Revolution began in 1910, many Mexicans were already living in very desperate conditions that were further exacerbated by a decade of violence and uncertainty across the country. And so for many, like Manuel, staying in their country would be a life or death situation. This was, it was either you stay and see what happens in uncertainty, or you try to find a better life for your family. The Mexican Revolution also coincided with, I will come back to that later. The Mexican Revolution coincided with significant societal and political transformation in the United States as well. This is now what I call the pull factor, right? The reasons that led people to come to the United States and settle here to be able to find a better life. So cities across the United States were rapidly growing. They were creating a need to expand local and regional transportation networks. And although the United States had managed to stay away from World War I and the conflict in Europe, by the time that the United States joins the conflict, there's a shortage of labor, of workers, in several industries across the country. And so companies across the United States were in a way desperate to maintain their industries going. And so this is kind of the setup to help us understand what's going to be the pull factors that are going to bring Mexican communities. And then the aftermath of the war, this is going to greatly influence the United States, and particularly in matters of immigration. So the war and the aftermath of the war and the devastation of the war in European countries, this coupled with two huge immigration laws that passed in the aftermath of the war, during the war. So in 1917 and in 1924, you have two different immigration acts that begin to limit and restrict European immigration for the first time in history. So in history, you have restrictions of immigration primarily affecting Chinese and Japanese and other Asian immigrants through the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. But because of the kind of aftermath of World War I, and because there is this heightened sense of needing to have homogeneity in the United States, but also because there is some kind of racial politics happening in the country, we start restricting European immigration. 1917 will be through literacy tests, and then 1924 is going to be through the implementation of quotas that are going to limit the number of Europeans coming into the country based on the on a percentage of the population already residing in the United States. So that's going to greatly influence American history. It kind of closes the door to this like melting pot kind of framework that we have ingrained, right, when we talk about in history as the United States being a country of immigrants. And so this is going to kind of close that door for immigration in that time. The reason why I bring this up is because the 1924 Immigration Act, as it's establishing quotas, it's going to exclude Mexican immigrants from coming. And this is because for much of the turmoil of the Mexican Revolution, and in the aftermath of World War I and of the Mexican Revolution, you are in American industries are going to understand how critical Mexican labor will be to keep their companies afloat, especially as European immigrants, primarily Eastern and Southern Europeans, who had been, driving the labor force for some of these kind of like blue collar, right, very exploitive labor. Now they're going to be needing more, someone to fill in the ranks. So Mexicans will be excluded from from the immigration law. However, whenever they cross, they do have to pay a tax. So I just wanted to clarify that they're still kind of, going through a process as they're coming to the United States. So now that we kind of see the kind of the national and international, in a way, context, I want to kind of just look into what is happening in the Kansas City region. So in the first decades of the 20th century, you have a maturing Kansas City. It's becoming an important transportation, industrial, and agricultural hub in the country. And the city's industries, like transportation, agriculture, meat packing, the stockyards, clothing manufacturing, among others, are really booming at this time. And so the industrial growth and regional prominence of Kansas City at the time is causing the two Kansas cities to expand both in population and geographically. So this, just to kind of give you an idea, between 1900 and 1930, so in a period of 30 years, the population of both sides, in both sides of the state line, more than double. So, this is a period of rapid growth for Kansas City on both sides of the state line. And so with all of these kind of, rapid growth, booming industries, and the wanting to maintain the booming industries afloat is going to be what sets up the stage to make Kansas City a kind of magnet of labor for Mexican immigrants. So starting in 1909, regional companies such as the Kansas City Southern Railroad, the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe Railroad, and the Frisco Railroad began recruiting men and Mexican workers along the U.S.-Mexico border. So they go to places like El Paso, Texas, or Laredo, Texas, to recruit workers to come to the Midwest and work in the railroad. So once recruited, they would come to Kansas City either to lay track and work in the yards here locally, or they were shipped out to other areas in the Midwest or the Plains. And so the first wave, this is one of the first waves of Mexican immigrants, and they were primarily comprised of single men, as the gentleman that you are seeing here on the screen. And they lived pretty much in boarding houses or boarding or rooming houses. So once they completed the job, then they would be going back to the border or moving to find other job opportunities, whether they were here in the Midwest or in California along the border, or simply they would just go back to Mexico. And so this kind of like constant movement created what historian Valerie Mendoza has called a transient bachelor society of Mexican men. And although some were able to remain in the Kansas City area and found employment in other industries, this first wave primarily was, experiencing precarious employment. And so because they had to move to find, economic opportunity, they failed to establish a permanent settlement in the region. And so again, these kind of turmoil of the Mexican Revolution, the labor shortages caused by World War I, and the restriction of European and Asian immigrants set the stage for the Mexican community to grow here in Kansas City. And as the region's railways and even streetcars were growing in the early 1900s, industries and such as meatpacking and the railway system really needed that steady labor force to ensure that their companies were booming. And so recruiters then began to encouraging Mexican workers, men, to come to the area with their families. And so according to historian Sherry Lamb Shermer, between 1910 and 1925, about 7,000 immigrants settled in Kansas City. And by 1930, that number would be estimated to 10,000 folks who were of Mexican descent living in the area. And so you have a kind of, a couple of settlements that are popping up as a result. They're moving into several Mexican neighborhoods, well, what is going to become known as Mexican colonias that are going to be established. On the Kansas City, Kansas side, you have 3. The largest one is going to be the Santa Fe Railroad Camp in Argentine, which is partially what you're seeing here on the screen, where families lived in boxcars and the trains, technically, for much of the community. And this was because the workers were tied to the work in the yards, so they had their families there. And as the company was bringing more and more people to work, there's not a lot of housing, so this was the solution to bring folks into the area. Then you have the second one is going to be emerging along the railroad tracks in Armourdale, and then the third is going to be in Rosedale, and that's where the Frisco and Katy railroads had provided also temporary boxcar camps for their employees and their families. And out of the 3 in the Kansas side, Rosedale is going to be the one that does not have as much contact to other Mexican families. So I will come back to Jean Klein's. I can clarify now. So yes, there is. Mexicans were not excluded from the quota system, so they were able to come and pay a tax, because they, like all immigrants, had to pay a tax to come into the United States. I hope that makes sense. If not, I'll clarify it a little more in the question answer system or time. And so then you have the Missouri communities popping up as well. You have a few settlements, railroad settlements, is similar to Rosedale in Argentine, that are going to be, tied to the railroad industry. But the largest settlement was going to happen in the west side, which is in a way coming into an older Swedish neighborhood. And that is going to be a neighborhood that's going to be in transition. So you're going to have Mexican families settling in, and then Swedish folks leaving and kind of attaining upward mobility as they move away from that particular area. So there's going to be a variety of ways that that Mexicans are going to be carving out spaces into the Kansas City landscape. And so you're going to have a very, very, very active recruitment of Mexican immigrants into the labor landscape of Kansas City. But it's really complicating the racial kind of landscape of the city itself. So Mexican immigrants are going to come into a very black and white binary, racial binary. And they come into the society not fully being white and not being black. They're an in-between group. And so in this in-between, because of their cultural differences, their language, their religion, they're coming in and being quickly racialized and portrayed as inherently inferior, as dirty, as criminal, and capable of, spreading diseases. So in 1918, when the Spanish influenza, or just, the 1918 flu, which is, mischaracterized as Spanish influenza, oftentimes people are fearful that the newcomers are the ones causing the pandemic to happen. And so rather than seeing the kind of economic and social issues that are affecting the newcomers, and trying to understand that they're coming into dilapidated communities, that they're being exploited in the workforce, that in a way, rather than blaming the kind of the cards that are stacked against the Mexican community coming into the Kansas City area, rather Mexicans are going to be blamed for their problems because of their culture and their kind of customs. So as more and more Mexican immigrants are coming into the Kansas City area, they're being kept from public spaces. They're denied access to hospitals, to grocery stores, in some cases, public schools. These kind of new policies and new segregation, de facto segregation situations are happening quickly as you have this influx of Mexican immigrants into the area, and it's being fueled by local leaders and local and welfare charitable organizations. Local newspapers are very, very much responsible for fueling these negative stereotypes of Mexican immigrants. And so you have kind of like this negative stereotype looming in the air, right? And to kind of explain it as to how it came out in the local newspapers, in July of 1917, a Kansas City Star newspaper article reports a health campaign against the disease menace in the West Side Mexican colony. And so Valerie Mendoza, in some of her work, has discussed that local newspapers, and this is her wording, that local newspapers castigated Mexicans and used racial slurs like greasers, or call them chile con carnes, which is something that I had never heard. And I, grew up in Mexico and grew up in El Paso, and I had never heard that one. So that was a new one for me. And then also they casted the entire Mexican community in Argentina as trouble for the police department. So as the immigrants are coming in and just trying to find a new place in society, they're already being cast as, dirty, as inferior, or as criminal. And so these are going to be the conditions that, the Mexican and then later Mexican Americans have to kind of fight against, right? And set a community against these odds. So kind of to see now that how were Mexican immigrants and Mexican families able to shape, and carve out spaces within the city, especially when you're coming into this very very racially hostile landscape. And so what they're going to do is they're going to, carve out a variety of spaces and use cultural organizations to meet their social and cultural needs. They're going to be very segregated away from whites and from Blacks in Kansas City. They're going to be almost in opposite sides, at least on the Missouri side. But they're going to be carving out spaces in a variety of ways. So we can stay there for a second. So first, by 1917, the West Side and Armourdale already had established numerous businesses. So although a lot of the folks that were fleeing the conditions of the Mexican Revolution were primarily working class, there were a few professionals that were moving into the area. And so you have a few doctors, you have folks who that are a little more middle class and have the ability to be able to create these businesses in the area. So you do have the two large kind of business areas in Armourdale and the West Side, but the heart of the West Side business community was along 24th Street. And this area boasted stores, bakeries, restaurants, pool halls, pharmacies, among other businesses. So now even if you go to, for example, Southwest Boulevard in the Missouri side, right, there are some businesses, but they're not as many as there used to be. Mary Bustamante, who was born in the West Side in 1924 and is one of the children of Manuel and Silveria Lopez. She recalled memories of the West Side business area, saying, quote, "Everything was so lively. My dad used to take us out on Saturday nights and walk on 24th Street. It was all lit up and there was a lot of people." For many communities, like Magdalena Rodriguez's family, who lived in the Rosedale area, the West Side and Armourdale played an important role in her family's life and survival, as she recalled that her family often visited the two neighborhoods because in Rosedale, there were no Mexican stores or food or Mexican food that they could access. So for them, visiting the West Side and Armourdale was extremely important. The West Side also formed important social organizations to help the community thrive in a way. One of them was the Unión Mexicana Benito Juárez, which this was a mutual aid society that provided numerous resources, financial support when the community needed, mostly for funerals, for example, and when people were not able to afford to pay for funeral, for rent. But they also provided advocacy for the community. They promoted also patriotism and ethnic solidarity and Mexican pride in the area. You also have later Club Tepeyac, which is a women's organization that is going to be formed under the auspices of the Guadalupe Centers, which I will discuss in a second. But it promoted volunteerism and fundraisers for the Guadalupe Center efforts. And then the final one that was created was Unión Cultural Mexicana, and I will discuss that one at the conclusion of my presentation. But these organizations that are forming in the area are coming together to form in a way like ethnic solidarity, right, and provide support and create a close-knit community within the various communities across Kansas and Missouri. One of kind of like the things that I always say are like critical for community formation is a Spanish newspaper. And the community established one called El Cosmopolita. It was founded by brothers Manuel and Juan Urbina, and because they did not have the resources to, I mean, they were middle class, but they did not have the resources to upkeep the paper afloat. It was financed by Jack Dassinger, and so the publication ran a 4-page weekly paper, and it ran between 1914 and 1919. It was a short run, but it was dedicated to news, entertainment, and information. So in its very short run, El Cosmopolita did a number of things. It, publicized job opportunities for Mexicans living on both sides of the state line. It publicized Mexican-owned and Mexican-operated businesses in the area that were safe for the community to go to. It also became a forum for the community to promote meetings or social gatherings. It advertised charities and fundraisers, but most importantly, the newspaper provided a space for workers to voice the abuses that they faced working both for the railroad companies and the meatpacking industry. They were very anti-Santa Fe Railroad because they believed that the company exploited the families, not only through their labor practices, but also because they were housing them in boxcars. And so the newspaper folds mostly because of financial reasons. And later on, you will have, Spanish newspapers coming out later on in the history of Kansas City, have a variety of them today in the metro area, but it comes from this tradition of ensuring that, you promote ethnic solidarity and provide the information, right, to people in in your own language. Something that became also a very important institution within the community was the Catholic Church itself. And you have a number of Catholic churches that are going to be providing services to the Mexican community because they often refuse, many of the established Catholic churches are going to be refusing services to the Mexican community. They were not offering, services or mass in Spanish, and often some were banned and only allowed to come in every now and then into the service. And because some of the community folks were devout Catholics, like having a Catholic church where they could that they could attend, it was really important for them. So, there's numerous examples of the role of the Catholic Church in Kansas City, but one, kind of like to highlight the importance of the church. There's an oral history by Felicia Ruiz. She was born in Morris, about 5 miles away from Argentina, and she recalls that she and her family would take a train ride to Kansas City, Kansas, to attend St. Thomas Catholic Church in Kansas City. And she recalls her experience knowing that there were many instances where her family knew that they couldn't go to a closer Catholic church because they weren't accepted. And so it was really important for her family to attend church, and they were able to find where, what churches would accept, as she called it, Mexicanos, and be able to, to just worship their faith. And in 1914, I'm sorry I'm jumping along this much, but I'm trying to keep it in a thematic way. You have the kind of the beginnings of Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, which is going to play a tremendous role in the West Side community for a variety of reasons. But in 1914, Father Jose Munoz, he was a Spanish priest who was living in Mexico and was kind of, in a way, ousted from Mexico due to the Mexican Revolution. And so he came and joined his family here in Kansas City. So in that year, 1914, he founded Our Lady of Guadalupe Church at 2341 Holly Street to serve the Mexican population of the West Side by providing services in Spanish. But within the first year, the parish had over 200 parishioners, which is huge, right? Like within 1 year, for it to be growing that fast. The space that they had settled or founded, the original Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, was immediately too small to hold the parishioners. So to accommodate the growing Mexican community, the diocese, under the leadership of Dr. Thomas Purcell, purchased a large stone church and rectory from the Swedish Manuel Lutheran Church. And so this building is going to be located on 23rd Street in Madison Avenue, which is now Avenida Cesar Chavez. And the church was then dedicated on October 5th of 1919. And the parishioners, kind of have to raise funds and pay back to the diocese to pay the debt for the buildings. So this is now, it operates as the Shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe. As much later, I believe in the 1990s, that particular parish gets combined with Sacred Heart, which is another church in the community. In particular, even though religion, right, plays an important role in the lives of Mexican immigrants, there is, the Our Lady of Guadalupe Church is going to play a very important role in building a cultural institution in the community, as they join with a Catholic group by the name of the Amber Club. And so at this point in time, this is kind of giving you a quick context. You do have the progressive era movement happening. So this allows women, primarily white and primarily elite women, to start, becoming involved in society, and then later, right, like towards the end of the progressive era, you have women earn the right to vote. And so, or fight for the right to vote, I should say. And so you have elite women's groups becoming involved in different aspects of society. And so you have, a number of charitable organizations that are led by women who are going to be addressing or attempting to address the conditions in which Mexican immigrants are living in. And some of them are going to be helpful, some of them not so much, but they're going to serve as an important avenue to try to address the kind of like the deplorable conditions in which some of the Mexican immigrants are living in. So at this time in the two Kansas cities, you have organizations like the Salvation Army really becoming involved. You have organizations later on like Maddie Rhodes also kind of emerging out of this period. And they're going to be holding fundraisers, food drives, gift drives for Christmas or Easter, among other efforts. And some of them, like I said, are a little problematic. Oftentimes they come patronizing, and they continue to perpetuate the negative stereotypes of Mexican immigrants as, some of them were deemed, or some of them kind of push this idea that Mexican immigrants needed to be quote unquote saved. And so some of them are going to be, they're going to kind of cause a little more trouble than they're worth, unfortunately. To give you an example, in 1921, there was a brief recession and it affected the Kansas City area, particularly in the railroad industry. And so there is this charity group called Associated Charities, I believe, in Kansas City, Kansas. And they hold this fundraiser to provide corn to Mexican families. In Argentina, they will be, helping them make tortillas and use it as a fundraiser. But what they're not knowing is that the charity organization in a way is going to later kind of team up and help them fundraise to support the deportation of Mexican immigrants due to unemployment rates going up. And, they're going to partner with the Chamber of Commerce, they're going to partner with the Mexican consulate, they're going to partner with even the Santa Fe Railroad to deport about 800 people at a time to free up jobs. And this is going to be a constant coming back. So that's kind of the reason why I mentioned that some of them, even though they're going to do some good deeds, they're also kind of perpetuating, some damage and harm to these communities as well. So the probably the most constant group that emerges out of this progressive era charity involvement and women's groups is going to be the Amber Club and the Guadalupe Centers. The Amber Club was a local Catholic women's group that had been kind of witnessing the hardships and injustices that immigrant communities were experiencing in Kansas City. So they had been working in the historic Northeast in Kansas City, primarily with the Italian community. And then later, they see the influx of Mexican immigrants into the community, and they move into the West Side and start kind of having a few efforts there to help the newcomers assimilate to new life. And so the Agnes Ward Amber Club, which was named after a social worker from Chicago, they formed in 1916. And like I said, they were kind of already navigating the Kansas City landscape by the time that they come into the West Side. But they're trying to care for what they said, the spiritual and the physical welfare of those in less fortunate circumstances. And so 2 years later, in 1918, the Amber Club hosts a vacation school, so a summer school, for the children of the West Side. And the women recognize that the needs in the West Side are extremely grave. And so they move in full time and leave, the Italian community from kind of like being really involved there to come to the West Side. And so with the support of Father Munoz, who helped found Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, the Amber Club then begins operating in the West Side out of Our Lady of Guadalupe's church rectory. The group is going to be running throughout its history a baby well clinic and other health services at the parish. They're also going to be hosting, holding sewing classes, cultural programming, night school to teach English, and in 1926, they're going to be purchasing the home adjacent to the church, which is, sorry, I'm going to go back really quick, which is let me see, it's this house right here next to the church, and turn it into the Guadalupe Center, which will be bringing in more people to be able to be served. And so you then have the center in a way flourishing under the leadership of Dorothy Gallagher. Dorothy Gallagher is part of the Amber Club. She is a Kansas Cityan. She comes from a wealthy family, and she will be serving as the director of the Guadalupe Center between 1926 and 1944. And so for her 18 years in the Guadalupe Centers, she really donated generously to the center and worked very, very much with the community without pay. And so that hard work and collaboration with the Mexican community in the West Side earned her the name the godmother of the West Side, or the godmother of Guadalupe. And here she is pictured with neighborhood children. I also wanted to kind of to note that while the Guadalupe Centers started as an effort to Americanize Mexican Americans, right, and help them transition into an American society, that it was under the leadership of Dorothy Gallagher that Mexican immigrants and kind of the upcoming second generation of people of Mexican descent in the community push the leadership of the Guadalupe Center to meet their cultural needs in a different way. Like, yes, they want to learn English. Yes, they would like to have, education opportunities. However, they want to do it on their own terms. So under her leadership and under her tenure there, the Guadalupe Centers expands to offer, social clubs for boys and girls, to kind of provide home economics courses, vocational training to kind of prepare kids, especially, to join the labor force in a variety of ways. They expand to have sports teams, but most importantly, you have the cultural celebration, like Mexican cultural celebration within the auspices of the Guadalupe Center through gran fiestas or large gatherings and other cultural programming that is relevant to the Mexican community at that time. So Gallagher is in a way encouraging the Americanization of the West Side, but she kind of understands that the community is wanting to have to celebrate the community heritage. So she takes a cue from them, to be able to do so. And so I know that I'm running out of time, but I want to cover a few more things. So the Guadalupe Centers is going to become a very important cultural institution for the Kansas City area, not just for the Missouri side, but for both sides of the state line there. It's going to provide these various services, educational opportunities, and it's going to become kind of like a hub for cultural celebration, a Mexican cultural celebration in Kansas City. This is really quick. Something that I've always found so fascinating is that still under her kind of tutelage, right? And the fact that the Mexican community was able to celebrate their own culture on their own terms, that the Guadalupe Center's kind of like dance troupe, if you want to call it, called Grupo Artístico, or the artistic group, they're invited to attend the 5th National Folk Festival in Washington, D.C. So they get to travel and represent the Guadalupe Centers and Kansas City through, kind of showcasing Mexican cultural dances, on the Capitol lawn, which is to me amazing for that time period, especially since we're still in the midst of the Depression, right? So a lot of these folks may not have, the opportunity to travel outside of the city. But just as my last point, I wanted to kind of talk about how the Mexican community is pushing, right, to claim their own space and belonging within the landscape of Kansas City. So they're pushing the Guadalupe Centers to recognize that they want to celebrate their cultural heritage, that they want to kind of have a voice in the programming that is offered at the Guadalupe Centers. And there's other ways in which that people within the Mexican community are also, demanding their own rights to the city. You do have in 1925 for Mexican American students want to register in an all-white school, and they were not able to attend because there is a huge resistance of white parents, and the school board in Argentine high school. So the students are admitted, but they, at some point, the parents start complaining, they file petitions, and they start kind of threatening the lives of students if the school is in a way integrated or allows to accept these forced students. And so one of the two, Saturnino Alvarado, starts campaigning for his kids and the 2 other kids that wanted to attend Argentine high school. And he kind of gains support that is their constitutional right as U.S. citizens, and so he starts mobilizing the community, and eventually the board is kind of entering a negotiation with them. So they said, we'll give you a separate classroom, and the parents don't accept, the Mexican parents don't accept. They also offer to pay tuition and transportation to take the students to the Missouri side, which is such an inconvenience, right? But the parents refused again. And so they're going back and forward after a year, and, with various governmental entities, but at the end of the day, the 4 students after a case get admitted into Argentine high school for the 1926-1927 academic year. So that's, we often think about these fights for civil rights coming in, during the Chicano movement, perhaps, or the civil rights movements, but these people were not passive to their experiences of of racism and discrimination. They were in a way tackling it on their own and ensuring that they could claim a space within the community. And the last thing that I wanted to cover, speaking of Gran Fiestas, I think that they were a very important tool to the Mexican community for a variety of reasons. Not necessarily because they get to, because they're able to celebrate their culture, their Mexican culture, in a very public, right, and visible way, but because through an organization, the Gran Fiestas become a way in which the community is going to kind of claim their stake within Kansas City, and it's going to be utilized as an educational tool. So the Unión Cultural Mexicana was founded in 1924. And this organization served, for a variety of reasons, kind of like a mutual aid society, but also, they were a group that provided support and advocacy for the Mexican community in Kansas City, but they also served as kind of, a welcoming organization for folks who were Mexican dignitaries, or if they were Mexican musicians and artists coming into the area, they were the first ones to kind of organize something in a community gathering to celebrate their visit. But most importantly, the Unión Cultural Mexicana really became this important vehicle to really fight for inclusion and to dispel the negative stereotypes about the Mexican community. They helped with the Gran Fiestas and launched an education campaign to educate white Kansas Cityans to Mexican culture. So through the Gran Fiestas, the community's inviting the white population of Kansas City to, see like, hey, there are negative stereotypes about us, that are being dispelled through local leaders and the newspapers. However, like, we're inviting you to see and learn about our culture and our traditions. And the really interesting thing about these Gran Fiestas is that the two communities on both sides of the border come together to celebrate these big fiestas, which are held in the summer, and then they start transitioning to celebrate Mexican Independence Day. And so these, the first one that gets held in Kansas City in 1926, and it's a fundraiser to raise funds for the church and for social services. And the celebration includes mariachi bands, courtship dances, traditional food, and it was again open to the public, and folks were inviting people from all the neighborhoods of the city. And so in 1927, you have the leadership of the Unión Cultural Mexicana kind of bringing this educational campaign to the next level. So in April of 1927, Dr. Nicolas Jaime, who was a doctor, he was one of the only Mexican licensed doctors in Kansas City. He was leading the Unión Cultural Mexicana at that time, and he helps organize this fiesta for 500 attendees at white attendees at Westport High School. And the organization is doing so to help cement a good relationship between the Mexican community and the white community in Kansas City. And I know that you can't see it in the newspaper clip here from that I have on the screen, but if you can see this here, it says a plea for understanding. And he's quoted saying that, quote, he begged Americans to try to understand the Mexican community better. And so I wanted to kind of showcase, right, how these organizations understood that they just didn't need to be present for their communities, but also that they needed to be good kind of ambassadors for the Mexican community within the large Kansas City area community there. And to me, these traditions like the Gran Fiesta that started in 1926, in a way still continue to present day with the various celebrations of Mexican American or Latino heritage celebrations across, in both Kansas and Missouri through, the Cinco de Mayo fiestas that are hosted at the Guadalupe Center every year, or even through the Fiesta Hispana, which is one of the largest celebrations, Mexican, Latino heritage celebrations in the Midwest, and that's been going on since the 1960s. So that kind of good ambassadorship of for the Latino community still exists today. And I just want to conclude by saying that, this is such a crucial period to understand how folks are going to be setting roots in the area. And that the post-war years is going to, bring lots of change to the Kansas City area, whether it's through catastrophe because of the 1951 flood, through highway construction and the dismantling of communities, or through, social and political mobility that is going to have folks being able to move away from these areas that were so important in the beginning of the 20th century. But I think that we can oftentimes oversee how these earlier decades in the earlier history of the 20th century in Kansas City really are important to shape the trajectory of Mexican Americans and later the larger Latinx community in the metro. So thank you, and I'm sorry I had such a hard time with my PowerPoint, but I would be happy to take questions if there are any.
I'm here. Oh, that was wonderful. I think the biggest piece of ambassadorship has to be food. I mean, when you think of it today, you can't go 3 days without eating Mexican food anymore.
Right. I always like to tell my students that, even to, and if you look at kind of like the impact, right, of the Latino community, not just in the Midwest, but in the United States, that like salsa is probably the most purchased condiment, right? Yeah. And so it's, even that's now like, part of our identity, just like, maybe pizza or hot dogs, maybe, right? We see them as American, but they're obviously immigrant community foods, right, that we've adopted into our own food culture.
We do have a question. Please clarify the contradiction that U.S. railroads recruited Mexicans at the border due to the U.S. labor shortage. Federal immigration laws that excluded Mexicans, yet Mexicans who crossed the border paid a tax. What years did these factors occur?
Yeah, so, well, there's the contradiction, right? Because you are in need of labor, and exploitable labor while we're at it, because these are hard jobs, right? These are hard jobs that people may, they're precarious, they, people can be fired easily. And yeah, it's really complex, right? And so in order to keep these industries afloat, especially at a time when immigration law is restricting the number of immigrants coming from Europe, you have industries, particularly in the Southwest, the kind of emerging agribusiness industry in the Southwest, really pushing to not restrict Mexican immigration at that time, starting in the 19 teens. And that is because, they need the labor, and if they don't have it, right, like their business is going to go, is going to kind of tank. And so you have folks advocating in Washington, D.C. To, just ensure that there's some sort of exploitable labor thing, population kind of filling these jobs. And then, so the immigration system, and I'm sorry I didn't like kind of make it so clear. So we don't have really like clear cut immigration kind of procedures and laws like we do now until the 19-teens. That's when they start cementing, with the exception of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so, usually you have, I think that like in the 19-teens, you start seeing, laws being passed that are starting to pay for taxes to start limiting, right? Like who's coming into the United States. You have, kind of more categories and restrictions emerge little by little. I know that there's specific diseases, specific conditions, especially that are affecting European immigrants. And then in 1924, that's when it hardens. Like that is when we start seeing the immigration system that we have today. We have the creation of, the Border Patrol, and so that is what kind of cements that immigration system. And so that's when you still have the idea like, okay, so if you can't, you have to do literacy tests or pay a poll tax, or not poll tax, excuse me, pay a tax, right, to come over to the United States. Sometimes the worker recruiter folks would be the ones paying that fee. But that is also, kind of to continue the door open, at least with Mexican immigration at the time.
Because there was a great need for labor, and with the railroads and then the meat packing plants and the heavily recruited. How large are the Mexican communities in both Kansas cities today?
Yeah, so I know that in the Kansas City, Missouri side, the Latino community, because it's also an evolving kind of community as well, with newer groups coming from other parts of Latin America in the Caribbean, Central America. So the Latino community on the Kansas City, Missouri side is about 10%. And on the Kansas City side, I believe it's roughly 30, roughly 30%. So, I mean, there's still the vast majority of folks still live on the Kansas side. And yeah, no, it's still a pretty sizable population that, to me, I think as coming into the Midwest, and seeing it, right, it's made invisible, even though they've had really long roots and deep roots in the area.
I have another question. Did the West Side Mexican community naturally disperse over the decades, or was it destroyed by the construction of I-35 Southwest Trafficway, which I assume maybe was part of urban renewal?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So it's a little bit of both. So in in the post-war years, you do have that a second kind of generation maturing, right? And so some of the gentlemen who are coming of age joined the war effort for World War II. And as part of World War II in the story, right, you come back after the conflict, and there are kind of benefits, right, that come off from serving at that time. So VA loans, obviously, or school kind of help, right, through I'm losing my mind, I apologize. And some Mexican families or Mexican veterans do get these benefits because they're this quote unquote in between group, right? And so even though Black veterans are not able to get the same benefits, some Mexican veterans do. And even though they create groups because sometimes they were denied these privileges, some of them are able to have access to house down payments and things. So that starts to also help move some of the families out of the West Side. And then yes, I-35 Southwest Trafficway 635 is just kind of hitting the community over and over and over again. And that starts kind of dismantling the community. So it's a little bit of both, as families are kind of attaining a little bit of socioeconomic and political, well, mostly socioeconomic mobility. They're going to other areas of Kansas City, at least on the Missouri side. And then the highway construction is really what hurts the community a lot.
Well, I have lots of questions, but we've been talking for a while. I did want to talk about maybe the GI Forum a little bit, that when you mentioned coming back from the war and that they were prohibited from joining the VFW and different veterans groups, and how important the GI Forum was to them. And is it still important today?
Yeah, I think that there's still, well, I think that that generation has found different organizations that suit their needs, right? So I feel that even though the GI Forum is kind of like one of those, quote unquote, old school organizations, that it still serves the community. And then you have other, quote unquote, I'm going to call it quote unquote old school organizations like LULAC, right? The League of United Latin American Citizens, which was started in 1927 or 29. This is when I tell my students, like, as long as you get the right era, we're good. They kind of evolved it within, even within communities. So I know that in Kansas City, we do have like an arm of LULAC through an educational side of things. I know, like in other parts in Western Kansas, for example, you have active LULAC chapters. And so it depends, right? So you do have these various groups kind of adapting to, newer generations and newer struggles. And then there's others where, sometimes the folks who are really involved, they start getting older and they're not as involved. So, it ebbs and flows.
Well, and you mentioned the Southwest, and there's a whole many settlements there that continue to grow with the meat packing plants, and just have been there historically and continue to grow. But we'll save that story for another night.
Absolutely. This is like part one.
Part one. And I just have to say to the audience that I've had the pleasure of working with you and Valerie Mendoza the last year as advisors to the museum. I'm collecting stories and hearing the voices of people of Hispanic descent to be shared with the Historical Society. It's been so valuable, and your work is just so empowering and so interesting. So thank you, and Valerie, and
Yeah.
I hope the Society will continue to take advantage of your skills and to bring more of these stories into the Historical Society's collections.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's necessary because, as I was mentioning, right, if these communities, well, on the western side, right, if Kansas City, Missouri is 10% of the local population, but there's no political representation, there's no historical representation of these groups, right? It's so easy to erase, right, the presence of Latinos across the board. And these stories are so important, and artifacts and oral histories and objects, and everyone's history matters and informs these larger contexts. So I do, if you're in the audience and you have ties to the stories that we talked about today or even later, right, just do know that your story matters in the history of Kansas or of Missouri, and that if you are wanting to share your stories, your family stories, that that there's organizations that can help preserve these important narratives and make them part of the history of the region.
We would value that. We'd also like to provide advice too on how people can preserve their own history and share it with the next generations, because that's so important. So thank you this evening. It's been a great program, and I wish you all the best with this teaching this year. Maybe you'll get to see students in person.
Yeah, no, I'm still teaching online, but I am excited to get back in the classroom, even if virtually.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Excellent program. Please join us again on Friday, September 10th at 6:30 to hear Dr. Ty Edwards present on Osage Women and Empire, Gender and Power. The program presents a new, more nuanced picture of the critical role of men and women of the period when the Osage rose to power in the Western Mississippi Valley, and when that power later declined on their Kansas reservation. I would like to say in closing that I've had the pleasure of working for the Historical Society for many, many years, and I will be retiring on September 2nd. So next month, I will be joining you in watching the program from the comfort of my living room. It has been my pleasure to host Museum After Hours, first in person and then virtually for the last 5 years. But I could not have done it without the work of others, including former employee Blair Tarr, Lois Hare, Austin Williams, Nate Forsberg, and Trey Johnson. Trey will be very capably assuming my role as host next month. So I want to thank the staff for all the hard work to bring this program to you. And I hope you will join us and Trey next month, September 10th at 6:30. And from all of us at Museum After Hours, good night.